There's a lot of bad criticism out there. But what does that mean? Asking what makes bad criticism is almost as tricky as asking what makes a bad movie. Some argue that since art and media is a subjective experience, it can only be judged subjectively, and they call out all criticism that makes any objective claim about something's quality, but is that entirely fair? I made a video a few months ago about the way I judge stories, separating the totally subjective experience of personal preference from the quality and skill in the execution of the artist's vision, and the story's ability to fulfill its implicit promises and satisfy its intended audience, and lastly, acknowledging the story's longevity in the form of thematic or emotional depth and poignancy. These four lenses must be separated from one another to properly judge stories. However, I think many critics still use this basic model and find themselves offering bad criticism, and I think I've discovered one reason why. So today, just as I've previously zoomed in on the fourth lens and how we judge something's poignancy, we're now going to be zooming in on the second lens, which examines A, how well all the different aspects of the storytelling and the production are executed, and B, how effectively they work together to complete the artist's vision. Now there's a lot to examine there, of course, but when using this lens, it's crucial to start by identifying the story's vision, its authorial intent, and the purpose behind its creation. And that's what I'm here to talk about today, understanding a story's purpose and aligning your standards and expectations accordingly. I believe this is crucial for every critic to understand in order to properly judge the stories they consume, and I hope I can make it a little bit easier for everyone to do so by breaking down the many reasons people tell stories and the many ways people experience those stories into three simple types. Now before we get into it, I'm just thinking out loud here, so if you enjoy my brain vomit, you know where the like and subscribe buttons are. Now without further ado, let's dive once more into the vast and fascinating world of fiction. Real quick, for the 2 or 3 subscribers that actually watch my stuff regularly, shout out to you out there, you know who you are. Sorry I've been quiet for so much longer than usual. For a while, I was just struggling to come up with a topic that motivated me enough to complete a script I felt good about. That is, until I watched a fantastic video by the brilliant channel Generic Entertainment. The video itself was a great exploration of why we tell stories, what they do for us, and the problem with people criticizing fiction for being unnecessary when they don't fully appreciate what motivated the author to write it or what it is people get out of it. I'd highly recommend you check out the video. It's an insightful look into the strange, ambiguous world of storytelling and this inexplicable phenomena of human culture called fiction that we all take for granted. However, I'm not actually here to talk about this video because I don't have much to add to what he said at the moment, and I hope you'll check it out yourself. It's in the description. I am, however, here to talk about a comment I saw beneath this video. Not that I have that much to add to the comment either, but I found it so deeply insightful that I had to integrate its ideas into my own and share them with you. To closely paraphrase the original comment, which was talking about books, so we'll be using book terminology, there are at least 3 types of writers and readers: instructive, representative, and hedonistic. Some people write stories with the intent to convey a message. Some write to reflect some particular aspect of reality, while others simply write whatever brings them pleasure, in a broadly defined sense. Likewise, some readers' measure of a good story is whether it conveys a good message. For some, it's whether or not it's realistic, and for others, it's whether or not it's fun. This is perhaps somewhat of an oversimplification, as most writers and readers are some combination of these 3, and it's worth noting that whether something has a good message or is fun is largely subjective, and being realistic in fiction is far easier said than done. However, the point is that a lot of bad criticism happens when people apply a reading type that's different from the author's writing type. For example, when you hear someone's harsh criticism focused on what a movie is saying, arguing that it's dangerous or harmful to its audience, it's likely an instructive reading of a hedonistic or representative story. You could argue that would still be a criticism worth making, and I might agree, but that's a topic for another day. When people like me ruin a conversation about a story by going, actually, statistically, or start complaining in the theater or making hour-long video essays about all the little inaccuracies of a movie, they're clearly taking a very representative reading of a primarily hedonistic or even instructive story. And of course, the guy who finds every movie boring if there's not a gory fight scene, explosive car chase, graphic sex scene, or string of snarky vulgar humor every 10 seconds is giving an extremely hedonistic reading of a story written instructively or representatively. Now for a couple clarifications. First of all, I am not saying that if you read a story the way it was written, that you will necessarily like it, just that you'll be in the right position to fairly judge it according to the artist's vision. When you adjust your reading type to understand what they were trying to do, you can then objectively say whether or not they did what they set out to do well. For example, let's look at Zack Snyder for a moment. We could argue about his merits as a filmmaker all day, but while I'll maintain that he's got talent, his talent is not exactly found in his storytelling. There are all sorts of extremely valid criticisms you can make toward his stories, but none of your criticisms are going to matter if you don't understand his writing type. He's a hedonistic storyteller, so if you try to criticize the realism of his films, your criticisms are going to fall flat. You've got to have a hedonistic reading of his stories before you can start to point out his flaws as a hedonistic filmmaker, which are still abundant. A second part of this clarification is that there's still plenty of room for subjectivity within each reading type, as I mentioned earlier. To use another hedonistic storyteller as an example, let's look at Quentin Tarantino, widely hailed as one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, yet not a personal favorite of mine. This is not because I don't appreciate his abilities, just because the things that bring him pleasure are gratuitously bloody violence, vulgar dialogue, and close-up foot shots for some reason, none of which are really what bring me pleasure in a movie. Similarly, people can and do argue endlessly over whether certain stories are really deeply profound or just pretentious and dumb, because what resonates with one person won't necessarily resonate with another, even if both are reading the story instructively. Now, I was going to make an additional clarification that you can judge things by a reading type the author didn't necessarily intend you to use, as long as you're careful about it. I was going to argue that all stories, even purely hedonistic ones, should have messages in order to resonate and need to have some level of realism in order to create immersion. So it's okay to judge a dumb, bombastic action movie like those in the Fast and the Furious franchise, for instance, from a representative perspective when they go so off the rails that they lose the audience. However, the more I thought about it, the more I changed my mind. I thought of instructive stories that completely eschew realism in every sense in favor of free artistic expression, and such films can be deeply evocative for it. This isn't the most extreme example by any means, but look at Francis Ford Coppola's version of Dracula, which is absolutely loved by critics and most fans of the story. It's far more expressionistic than realistic. The sets, costumes, and effects are all flamboyant and theatrical. It's not trying to be grounded or believable, but it's sure as heck evocative. So when the same director flops with something like Megalopolis, I don't know that the issue is the lack of realism as much as the incoherence of the message it was supposedly trying to convey. So after some thought, I ultimately think that we should judge our stories purely on the grounds they were meant to be judged on after all. Just remember that most stories use some combination of all three writing types. Take a largely hedonistic action story, for example. If the setting, plot, and style are fairly grounded in reality and expect you to get immersed in the world, even if it's mainly focused on fun dynamics and bloody action and spectacle, then it can be judged for its lack of realism, not because all stories need realism, but because this particular story does. Meanwhile, a similar story with a more fantastical setting and tone can get away with less realism because the intended experience doesn't require it. I don't deny that it can be tough to know the difference sometimes. It can be hard to tell what the artist intended you to feel when they fail to balance their conflicting tones and styles, or when they fail to convey anything effectively at all. But what's most important is that you learn to separate your own preferences from objective criticism when examining the artist's writing type. As long as you're careful not to criticize an artist for not being instructive or representative enough simply because that's what you would have preferred, you're doing good as a critic. Now, even though I said we'd be zooming in on the second lens of my criticism model, I now want to zoom back out, because discussing fiction is complicated, and I'm afraid these lenses can't always be so easily separated. To go through the four lenses again in the context of writing and reading types, we all initially judge our stories through lens 1, the totally subjective lens, and whether or not you like a story when looking at it through that lens will largely be determined by whether your reading type is aligned with the author's writing type. as well as whether the writing type was the one you were expecting and whether it was consistent throughout the story, which I suppose would be judged through lens 3. And to be clear, it's totally fine if you don't like a story purely for those reasons. After all, I'm generally not a big fan of purely hedonistic stories, but I don't judge them objectively based on that preference. If you're going to offer serious criticism, especially if you're going to tout it as objective, you need to then look through lens 2, the lens of objective quality, and identify the author's writing type, align your reading type with it, and judge it accordingly. If it's a hedonistic story, how well does it do at eliciting the kind of pleasure the author is going for? If it's instructive, how effectively does it convey its message? And if it's representative, how realistic is it in the particular areas in which it's trying to be grounded and believable? I say it like that because it's virtually impossible to be totally realistic in every conceivable way, and a totally realistic story probably wouldn't be that enjoyable anyway. From here, depending on the writing type, you can then determine the other lenses through which you're probably intended to judge it most heavily. If it's hedonistic, you can probably just go back to lens 1, since all it's trying to do is create a subjective experience. If it's heavily instructive, it's definitely intending to be judged through lens 4. In fact, you could argue that lens 4 just exists for judging instructive stories, though I'm not necessarily saying that more hedonistic and especially representative stories can't be deeply poignant in their own ways and become long-lived in the cultural zeitgeist. And finally, representative stories are, well, I guess you just judge realism and accuracy through lens 2, unless you wanted to make an entirely new lens for that. And hey, this is just me making crap up here, so you can do that if you want. In fact, as I wrap up this discussion, I encourage you to take all this nonsense I'm spouting and make it work for you. If something I said made sense here, but you don't think it works as a whole, what would you think about differently? What do you think of my attempts to overcomplicate the living heck out of everything? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. I really would love to hear your feedback on my process. Maybe in the near future I'll make a video all about why I do this, but I'm really not just trying to overcomplicate everything for the sake of it. I believe it's important to understand what makes all fiction effective and to talk about it intelligently. And as we do, as we learn to look at stories through the proper lenses and appreciate them for what they are and what they do well, we can gain more from them and learn to tell more effective stories ourselves. And we can have more civil, nuanced discussion surrounding them. That is my hope. That is why I have this channel, and I hope you'll join me in that vision. Until next time, never stay silent.